Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar series. This is number 2 in our 6-part series with Peter Bertel, and we have a special guest for each of the series. Next slide, Charlene. Actually, let me actually just say what this part of the series is what legislation will impact local education practices. Thank you, Charlene. I'm Aaron Heinzman. I'm Corwin Senior Professional Learning Advisor here in California. There's my contact information, aaron.heinzman@corwin.com, and my phone number. If there's anything you may need after our webinar today, please reach out to me. If there's any questions maybe we don't address or you think of something later, again, please reach out to me. I'm here in California in Los Angeles. A few quick Zoom keeping reminders. First of all, in the chat box, please ask questions. We'll have a Q&A at the end of our session, and if there's any questions we don't get to, I will respond to you via email, or I can give you a call as well. And then make sure the setting is set to all panelists and attendees. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and your certificate of attendance will be sent to your email in the next few days. Also, the email that you'll receive it from is info@k12.corwin.com. Just make sure that it doesn't go to your spam box. Also, we have free webinars here at Corwin. Here's our upcoming ones on September 27th, October 4th, October 18th. Great Corwin speakers. So tune into those and just register at corwin.com/webinars. Oh, okay, there you go. I'd like to hand it over to Peter Bertel. Let me just share a little bit about who Peter is. He's the Executive Director of the Professional Learning Coalition and former Executive Director of CSESA, the California County Superintendent Education Services Association. That's a lot of big acronym. His experience in state education policy includes serving as a legislative advocate for numerous California school districts, county offices, and professional associations. Peter?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to present this, and it's an honor to be sharing this presentation with John Hattie. So the purpose of this first part of the presentation is to discuss the recently passed legislation here in California. You'll see on this front side my email address. If we're not going to go in super detail on each of these bills. So if you're interested in any of the bills or the specific language or what the ultimate outcome is, I'm going to predict that. But if you want to check any of those or any other question, please just send me an email. Or if you'd like more information about the Professional Learning Coalition, as Aaron indicated, is comprised primarily of school districts around the state, some county office of education, and other organizations as well. There are 3 bills that were 3 key bills from the perspective of K-12 education that were approved by the legislature by the deadline, which was September 10th. So this is fairly recent information. The governor has until October 10th to act on these bills. We expect he will sign all 3 bills, but at this point they're just on his desk for action. The first bill, we have several slides on it, is AB 167, which is the budget cleanup bill. Which sort of the theme of it is there were delusions of grandeur when the budget got passed that have been upended by COVID and staff shortages and just the general lack of time. So most of this bill actually provides some more flexibility for districts on implementing the provisions of the budget. On independent study, now says you can put a student on independent study starting the first day of quarantine if they're quarantined for COVID and get funded for it. And it used to be that you had to have a signed written agreement before you could start the instruction. Now it says you have 30 days to sign the written agreement. So those are both key changes in responding to the struggles that districts are having. There also is recognition of the huge staffing shortages. And in some cases, districts are likely to lose days of instruction, which in California means a loss of funding. So they put in place a waiver provision so districts can apply to the state to continue to get funding for those days. Continuing to some more provisions. Next one, Charlene. On staffing shortages, the other thing they did is, I know there's a huge shortage of substitutes. This doesn't necessarily fix that. But what it does do is allow a substitute teacher to stay in the same classroom for up to 60 days. The prior limitation was 30 days. It actually was 20 days for special ed classes. So this is a big change in terms of allowing the use of a substitute to provide some stability in those classes. Next slide. Again, we're still on AB 167. The budget included $547 million in one-time funding for what they call the A through G completion grants. Districts were required to develop their plan to use those funds by January 1st. And this bill recognizes there's just too much money, too much going on, too many plans. So they moved that deadline back to April 1st. And then arguably, I think the major change is with regard to the K-6 expanded learning program. This is the program where the requirement is that you offer 9 hours per day of combined instructional time and before and after school for students in K-6. And in addition, that you offer 30 days of non-school programs, so additional time that would also be 9 days in length. So it's a huge change in terms of the service model here in California for grades K through 6. And when they passed the budget, they acted like you would all have it in place at the beginning of the school year, which clearly you don't. And condition of apportionment means if you didn't, then you don't get the funding. So they have removed that language, allowed you to use the funding for planning, and the entire tone of that section now is that you're putting in place a program to have this operational by beginning next year, 22-23. And I hope to have time to ask Dr. Hattie some questions about how you can use that time most effectively. So moving on to the next bill. Again, Charlene, yeah, the AB 599. Again, each of these bills have passed the legislature. They were negotiated with the governor's administration, so we are expecting that he will sign them. We will know for certain on that by October 10th. This has has to do with a thing called Williams schools, Williams Settlement Schools. This is a list of schools that are identified as a number of criteria, and the County Office of Education is required to visit those schools, ensure that they have adequate textbooks for every student, they have adequate facilities, and they have appropriately credentialed teachers, and then report their findings both to the state and to the governing board of the school district. So, there's no specific action per se, but it certainly is highlighting, potential concerns with these schools. To put it in perspective, it's a list of more than 2,000 schools. And so we've had the same list in place for 6 years. This bill will require a new list to be developed this spring. So that will catch somebody in the state by surprise, now having to explain why they are now on this list and what it means. And for county offices means visiting them. It also will now include charter schools. And this list will then be revisited, refreshed again, changed again in 22-23, and then every 3 years thereafter. And interestingly, given the shortage of staff, one of the indicators that puts a school on the list is if more than 15% of the teachers at the school do not have a preliminary or clear credential. So if you're heavily using interns, for example, then your school would end up on this list. So that's I don't know if I call it Christmas future, it's spring of 2022. And the last bill I wanted to touch base on, Charlie, next slide, AB 101. This bill mandates an ethnic studies course for high school graduation. Most of the write-ups I've seen say that it would be effective 29/30, which is a true statement. That's when it becomes a condition graduation. But it requires that districts start offering this course by 25-26. So for those on the call that are at the high school level, it's not a crisis right around the corner, but it's certainly something to be aware of and planning for. So if we can move to the next slide, Charlene. So, I had the liberty in talking with Corwin about comments to make, and these bills really provide you some immediate relief on the staff shortage and the time constraints, not a lot, but some. And they put in place some programs for the future, but they don't really change what I would say are the priorities this fall. The key development in that regard is not the end of the legislative session on September 10th, but the fact that the recall of the governor was defeated on September 14th. So we know we're going to have the same governor with the same priorities, and then that allows us to be pretty confident about the priorities for this fall. The first is the legislature and the governor approved a $1.5 billion educator effectiveness block grant. Districts need to develop their plan, approve their plan for how they're going to use those funds by the end of this December. So that's coming up fairly quick. You can spend the money through 25-26, so there's time to put that in place. This was strongly supported by the Professional Learning Coalition because it goes to all school districts and state and provides them resources for a district-developed professional development program. The biggie on the list is probably the K-6 expanded learning opportunities. This is a high priority for the governor. $1.8 billion this year. It's going to be growing over time to $5 billion statewide. And as I said, the goal is to ensure that every student in grades K through 6 has access to a 9-hour school day, combination of the school day and before and after school, and then also has additional 30 days of service that are non-school days. So it's sort of like summer school, after school. And then finally, universal transitional kindergarten. This is another priority of the governor's to expand transitional kindergarten over between now and 25-26, such that all 4-year-olds will be served in transitional kindergartens in every elementary and unified district in the state of California. So since I've defined those priorities, that sets it up for me to have some questions to ask Dr. Hattie. Really super honored to be presenting with him. Dr. Hattie is an award-winning education researcher and best-selling author with nearly 30 years of experience examining what works best in student learning and achievement. His research, which is better known as visible learning, is a culmination of nearly 30 years synthesizing more than 1,700 meta-analyses comprising more than 100,000 studies involving over 300 million students around the world. So it's really a pleasure to have you join us in this call today. You saw the major funding sources here in California. If I may, I'd like to start with the last one identified, the expansion of transitional kindergarten. And just ask what issues do you think are critical for schools to address as they plan to implement this dramatic change in early education in California?
Well, thanks, Peter. And it's good to be with you, even though it'd be nicer if it was in person, but that's not the state of our world at the moment. I think this notion of universal 4-year-old is pretty exciting and pretty important. So many students start school at age 5 when they come into the regular school, so far behind. And sadly, there is a lot of evidence that if we don't deal with those issues very, very quickly, they never catch up. So those early days are really critical. But there is a really important part of that, though, Peter, is that it's not just getting them into a schooling system, it's what we do with them when they're there. And certainly when we started this notion here in Australia about 10 or so years ago, there was a massive increase of 4-year-olds, but it didn't make a difference because we didn't focus on the right stuff. And the right stuff is making sure, as you hinted from some of the other legislation, making sure that we have trained teachers overseeing these programs. There is expertise we need in these programs. The second is count the language. Those 3- and 4-year-olds, it's all about language, language, language. I know so often we talk about play in the sector, and play is not unimportant, but it's only important if it generates language. And as we know, many of the kids at that age, their fundamental question in life is why? And I'm at a luxury stage now, Peter. I have 4 granddaughters, and right at that age, so it's very good. They're brilliant teachers. One of them last week taught me about how to play snakes and ladders. They've got that ability to be self-regulators. They've got that ability to ask why, and we've got to foster that. Sadly, many of them by age 8 switch from why to what, and that's not where we want to go. So how do we get that language really high? And one of the things I'd be encouraging the preschool sector to do in California is to look at quality indicators and make sure that we say to our parents that when you come into the setting, we have these quality indicators. We have these indicators that it is a language-rich environment. We have these indicators that we are looking at how your children are building a concept of the world. The why questions, they're trying to work out what the world's all about. So how do we foster that? And I do think that we need to be very smart about trajectories, making sure that we are very good at tracking these students from the day they come in at age 4, right through to preferably 8, if not longer, so that we can learn as a whole sector, how do we get smarter about early stages? And so I think this can make a profound difference to the quality. You won't get that effect for another 10 or 15 years, but each student who comes in at an earlier stage, provided they come into quality care centres, can make a huge difference. So I think this is probably the one that would have the biggest long-term investment in the quality of the life of many of the students in your state.
Well, following up your phrase about the trajectory, the other major priority of the governor is this K-6 expanded learning program, which we already have a school day, obviously, for students grades K through 6. So this is really about expanding the after-school opportunities and before-school opportunities, and then summer sessions, intersessions. What would you say is the best use of that additional time to address the kind of, sort of related to the question you just talked about? How should schools be approaching that, and especially now that they have a whole year to plan it?
Well, just before I go off the early childhood one, I have to put a push that a new book on visible learning and early childhood settings coming out, I think, next week. So it's good timing. It wasn't planned that way, but it is good timing. Look, on the K to 6, one of my worries always is that the belief that more time is going to solve everything. Like, if that was the case, Australia would be number 1 in the world, because our kids go to school for the longest school day and the longest school year in the world. Ironically, the one that goes almost the least is Finland. So we know from the meta-analyses that summer schools have a very small effect. We know adding more hours to the day have a more effect. Then we have to turn it around and say, if we're going to do all that, it's more demands on our teachers. One of the things we've learned from COVID is our schools not only have to be effective, they have to be efficient. And many students are saying, oh my goodness, I can do at home in 2 to 3 hours, which takes me 5 to 6 hours at school. So the first question I'd ask is, how can we be more efficient in the time we've got with our students, and not necessarily punishing them by making them do more and more and more? And this comes back to probably the big question that's hinted right through your legislation, and that is the expertise of the teachers. And I know you have massive shortages. I would love your state to be really bold and say this is the massive opportunity to restructure our career structure of teachers, to focus it around expertise as well as experience. I think it's a way that we are going to turn around the notion of how we can get more people to come into our profession. So my worry is with the expanding is that we're going to have perhaps more and more amateurs coming in to take these kids as opposed to the experts. But the other thing I'd ask to do is that, again, with the COVID experience we've had, is how do we get our educators, not only within our schools and our school leaders across our schools, to be smarter at sharing resources? Like, we've learned, but you don't always have to be in this physical place called school to learn. Like, I am a fan that we do bring them back into the regular class, but we don't have to be there. And I think we can do a lot more of getting some of our students within our school and across our schools to really have the opportunity to have more expertise in terms of doing it. So I'm not a great fan that just lengthening the time is necessarily going to make a difference. But I do see opportunities in that bill to be smarter about accelerating kids, reinvesting in kids. And my big message is, don't presume that kids have necessarily gone backwards over this last year. No matter what their label, no matter where they come from, we need to be smarter at doing great diagnosis, great discovery of where every student is. And I think that's one of the big advantages that we can do, and perhaps start to mix up. I only wish California had abolished its year-based curriculum system, because in any one year, kids are all over the place. If you'd gone to a more of a levels-based curriculum, I think you'd have a much faster trajectory of getting more cooperation across schools. So on the one hand, not a great fan of necessarily lengthening things. But let me raise one issue that I'd spend a lot of money on if I was a principal in any school in California, and that's coaching. Now, I want to be very clear here. Coaching done by experts. We've discovered here in Australia that there is an incredible number of teachers who are no longer in the school system, who don't want to work 5 days a week, who are prepared to come in and have coaches. And we won't allow coaches in the schools unless they're ex-teachers. And the second thing is they almost have to have an IEP, an individual plan, so that it is aligned with what's happening in the classroom. And already we can show the evaluations that that's making a huge difference. It's using the multi-tier service system to identify these kids. It's working along with the teachers. It's not necessarily taking the kids out of the class. It's adding in terms of that extra time. And so I think if we get really smart about coaching, that's where I'd be spending a lot of the funding on in that bill. And then for what you're doing is you're bringing a lot more expertise back into the school system. At the same time, by not presuming, you're making sure that the kids who need that one-on-one coaching or that small group coaching are getting it. So that's where I'd be looking at investing if you want to really do acceleration.
Well, I almost feel redundant asking the next question because I think you touched on a number of key points, but I think one of the important decisions faced by school districts up and down the state is how they're going to use this educator effectiveness block grant. $1.5 billion, they could spend it over 5 years. The language it gives a lot of flexibility. It says it could be used for coaching, it can be used for accelerated learning. It's available for school site administrators, for teachers, and for classified employees. So districts have a lot of flexibility. And between now and the end of December, they need to adopt a plan. So, what are building on what you just said, what would you say are the key points as they put that plan in place?
Well, Peter, where I would start is I want to look back over this last year, which, as we know, has been interesting in lots of different ways. And there is a bit of an assumption too often that it was a disaster, that it was learning loss. But the evidence is coming in, and believe it or not, there already is the first meta-analysis on COVID studies. And what it's showing is that the trajectory of kids from the start of the year to the end of the year last year was only slightly down from the previous 10 years, slightly down. And you've got to pause and say, learning continued. It continued almost at the same rate on average. Of course, there were massive equity issues and there's variability, but on average, it was about the same. So what I'd ask each school to think about is look back over the last year and say, hey, how come we were so successful under incredibly weird conditions? And many of the things we've done is over the last year is we've learned to be more efficient. We've learned to work together as a school team a lot more. We've seen a lot more collective efficacy by the school leaders working with their staff to making sure every kid is being served by great teachers and with all the right facilities. We've narrowed and been very selective about what we cover in the curriculum, so we're allowed to go deeper into some of the areas. And so the first thing I did is I get every staff member to write a one-page of bullet points of what worked well over the last year. On the back of the page, I'd ask them to say, and what can we stop? And that's a really hard one. And then have a discussion across your school about how we can capitalize on what we did last year that was so different, and I would argue so powerful, to bring back and create a new normal. And that's a probably better way of answering this question than immediately going to some of the answers we want to go to. And some of that is how we can use that money to invest to support teachers to be more efficient in what they're doing, and building up the professional learning and investing in the expertise. Because I think we've learned a lot in the last year about efficiency. Now, yes, then I'd go back to what we were saying before, Peter. This is where notions like coaching can make a big difference. This is where we can look at how we could use the response to intervention model more effectively. This is how we can start to look at how we share our students within a school more effectively. Like, I'm not a fan of saying that we should continue distance education forever. Kids want to come back to school, if for nothing else, to be with their friends. It's social. But there are a lot of things that we did last year that we can do in the regular classroom. Like on distance learning, you couldn't stand up in front of the kids and talk the whole day, which we tend to do in the regular classroom. We had to have gradual release of responsibility and making sure that we don't go back to that old model where we stand and orchestrate every single lesson. We had to teach the students some of the skills of not only working by themselves, but as it was noted earlier, one of the seminars coming up, how we can build student collective advocacy. And we had to do that over COVID teaching. So I would hope that this is an opportunity to break with some of the old grammar of schooling, which worked for many kids, but not all, and say, how can we get smarter? So my first reaction would be, let's get the profession working on saying, how can we come up with the ideas that really work? Peter, I think it's interesting when I read your legislation and I look at what happened over the last year in COVID, I've yet to see a single government decree that comes out and says, here's how to be an effective teacher in COVID teaching. But when you look at the evidence, it happened. This has been, in my lifetime, the biggest educator-led revolution we've ever seen. And it served our students extremely well. Not as good as we hoped, but it served them extremely well. And so I think I'd start there. Get this notion of what worked really well. How do we also stop some of the things that didn't work so well? And then from that, I could see schools coming up with answers. Don't presume, start looking at it. Like the language we're using now, reinvesting and accelerating. Let's make them normal. That's what should happen all the time. And as Hank Levin showed in your country many years ago, the kids that most benefit from acceleration are the kids below average. They don't need the wide grasp of content that we throw at them.
Aaron, I don't know if we want to open it up to questions from others, but that was very thought-provoking and really valuable. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Peter. I know Beth had a question here, but I think it would be Charlene. Beth, we can get back to you about a transcript. The session is being recorded, so you'll have access to that. If there's any questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I know Peter shared his email as well, and I think, sure, there we go. And I lost my chat. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, again, you can put them in the chat right now. Otherwise, we're running to the end of our time here. But again, you have my email. It's aaron.heinzman@corwin.com. Also, Peter's email. It's also will be in the recording. As far as our upcoming institutes, if you'd like to see more of John, he'll be October 5th and November 4th. March 9th, his new book, John Elmerode and Kateri Thunder, will be facilitating that institute. They're one-day institutes, and they're great. And they're great for your staff if you have about 30 folks or up to 30 folks to attend those. So, Charlene, the next. Oh, there's me again. Again, if you have any questions about any of the content that we went over today, whether it's from John or from Peter, please reach out to me. Again, there's my contact information, and it'll also be included in the webinar recording as well. And there's John's new book that will be out in about a week or so, Visible Learning in Early Childhood, a couple of his other titles as well. As a thank you for participating in our webinar today, we will offer a 20% discount plus free shipping on any of these titles. Just please reach out to me if there's any sort of bulk orders. I'll be happy to help you with that as well. Again, thank you, Peter and John, for your time today. Hope you enjoyed the webinar series. Again, this is the second in the webinar series. There's on December 1st, Trudy Arriaga will be with us. And for the fiscal outlook for 2022-23, maintaining momentum for improvement. So thank you everybody for joining today. I hope you have a great rest of the week. And please reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer.